and same-sex thinks there'll be gay marriage in the next 5 years or so. So all things considered, Cuba's undergone some pretty radical changes on the gay rights front, and the way things are developing. I think that soon, if not already, especially in Havana, comparing Havana to parts of the United States, I think Cuba will exceed the United States in terms of gay rights in the very near future. When I was conceptualizing this project, I sort of framed it as a cultural exchange, but in the sense that I was going to go to Cuba and teach the poor Cuban gay activists how the United States does gay activism. And I'm glad to say that I think I taught them nothing, and they taught me a lot. And I think that that really says a lot about the fact that gay rights activists or LGBT rights activists here in the United States and LGBT people in general can really learn a lot if they look at the LGBT situation of people in other cultures and other countries. So that's something that I would like to encourage, and really the main thing that I learned from this trip. So, does anyone have any questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
You said that the two major issues for the same-sex people were media images and education. Was there anything in their curriculum, or is it even on their radar? Maybe it's not an issue there. What about gay bashing or hate crimes?
Right. That's not an issue, surprisingly. The person at the club that I was talking to, and the same-sex representative mentioned it also. And I saw it myself walking around Havana. People will say something like, "Oh, there go the locas," or whatever, but there's no violence against like what you would see in the United States, which is a bunch of drunk, bored, straight guys beating up the local queer or something like that. That just doesn't happen. And when even when they yell something at like "Hey, loca" or whatever, it's more just it's just how Cubans are, because whenever they see someone else, they greet them with an identifying word. So it's not really like an expression of aggression or hatred. It's just like, "Hey, gay," But that, I was surprised that's really not a problem there at all from anyone that I spoke to.
Did they mention at all like any are there any like cultural exchange links, I guess, with any other like gay rights movements? I'm thinking like more like Latin America, but for example, were they saying like, oh, like this like exchange or like this trip to Cuba from the United States, like that's something that is not the norm for I guess like making links with like activism in Cuba to other like parts of I'm thinking the hemisphere.
I don't understand the
Am I
question.
making sense? Okay. So you guys went to Cuba and met with all these people.
Mm-hmm.
Do similar things happen with Cuba and other countries in the hemisphere?
I don't think so. Whenever anyone would mention about any or refer to any other group, like the same-sex meeting, whenever she would mention meeting with other groups, it was usually groups from the United States. Though I think they might have mentioned something about Argentina, which is the other. Argentina is the leading gay rights country, I guess, in Latin America, because they legalized same-sex marriage. Harper, did you have a question?
Yeah, you talked a lot about how the government has changed over time towards LGBT communities in Cuba. And the only example you gave of them really rallying the government was to pay for surgeries after they defunded that. Are there more examples of civil rights movements that were similar, say in the U.S., occurring in Cuba to change legislature in Cuba towards the LGBT community?
There aren't like civil. There's not a civil society in Cuba because there's only one party, the Communist Party. So a women's rights group is illegal, because that's why do you need that? You just talk to your local Communist Party representative, and he or she will file your claim the next time that the Communist Party wants to know what you think. So there wasn't like a similar equal rights movement. Most of the recent changes came from the work of Cinesex, which is an arm of the government. So that was one way that it's really different between the United States and Cuba.
There haven't been any sorts of protests ever in history or groups coming together against the government for these rights not going to Cinesex even before it was created?
The last thing that I came across in any of my research was around the 1970s when the artistic community, which is I think what the film focuses on, was kind of pissed off with the way things were going. So they were sort of actively opposing the government. But other than that, no, I don't think there was any sort of any kind of large protest organized or unorganized.
You mentioned some of these prostitutes are able to make a good living off of tourism. Where is the tourism coming from? And has there been any kind of sort of economic colonialism? If there's that much money flowing in from other states, where is it coming from? Who's bringing it? Are they bringing other ideas or strategies for advocacy with them? Or are they just bringing their dollars and that's it? Or whatever the currency would be?
There were a lot of European tourists, and then also from what they were telling us, we were the first Americans of the season, but there would be more Americans coming. Well, I mean, you can take humanitarian missions or educational missions or things like that. So you can take a mission where you go and take books to a library and then enjoy the beaches for the rest of the week or something, which is not what we did. But I'm saying that's a completely legal way to get to Cuba. In terms of bringing any strategies of activism, I don't think so. They didn't mention that being a focus of any of the foreigners coming in. But like I said, I don't think they really need it. I mean, they're very quickly outpacing the United States in terms of what they've been able to do, mostly because it's the government that's sort of the driving function instead of sort of this behemoth that refuses to budge on anything. Yes, Catherine.
Okay, so Cinesex has these support groups, including one for metrosexuals, so they're able to discern between gender and sex preference and expression of self and all these nuances. That's great. Do we find in Cuba that it's LGBTT, not LGBO and TT? Is there relative unity between these groups insofar as you could possibly perceive because they're not really allowed to advocate except with the government? That make sense?
Yes. I think your question is because like in the United States, the gays and the lesbians and the bis ditch the T's all the time because T is a bigger deal than LGBT. I don't think so. I hesitate to say anything definitively because, like I said, she was the trans director, so she was a little bit biased. But from the way she described things, it was kind of each organization doing its own thing. So like the gay men did their own thing, and the lesbians did their own thing, and the emo gays did their own thing, and the trans emos did their own thing. And I don't think it's a function of the gays hate the lesbians and the gays and the lesbians hate the trans or anything like that. I think it's just the context and the way that they have to work that just makes them kind of focus on doing their own thing under the kind of guidance of an umbrella that is sex. Right. And the fact that it's the gays and the lesbians doing most of the work for gay marriage is just because they're the most active groups. Yes.
Is the like gay emos, the emo gays and the emo lesbians and the emo trans, like that's a whole another culture, like separate? Does it seem like that's
the same as our emo?
Yeah,
yes.
Is that okay? So
Subculture.
so that's really like they're a separate like subculture.
Hipster trans.
Like a recognized one, because I mean here,
Yeah.
you know, you have like sort of more, you have different cultural groups within LGBT.
Yeah, I
but
mean,
there it's like a really separate.
from how I understand it, it's basically you walk in there with two people and you say, we're the trans emos and we want to have a support group, and they say that's fantastic. We want to encourage and we want to support your individual expression. So I mean, she never gave any numbers, so it might be something like there are 3 trans emos and the 5 emo gays or something in Havana.
Are there other like subcultural groups?
Yeah, I mean, she listed a lot. Those are just the ones that I remember.
So in theory, hipster trans identified
Hipster trans.
gay punk lesbians could come forward and ask for a space and time.
Absolutely.
We need to go
Awesome.
looking, Catherine.
I just from like you said, I sort of was picturing like all the gays who were not emo, all
Right.
the emo gays.
It's a real defining trait.
Yes. Yeah. I don't, like I said, I don't know how common each of these specific groups are, but I mean, the fact that she mentioned them and said that we have a support group for the trans emos, like, tells you something, I guess.
I was just asking, did it seem like they would have, and from your observation, both your interviewing and your observations were 2 separate questions, but did it seem like they would experience any kind of, I guess, conflict between trying to be, obviously, as open to anyone who walks in the door that wants to start a support group, but at the same time lobby for rights that would be broad-based and granted to all on a government level? I mean, lobby, obviously, from an internal perspective, I guess, but...
What do you mean?
Well, you said it's both sort of a government health organization, but it's also an organization which is largely promoting reform within the government.
Right.
So it's sort of serving the role of providing support services and attempting to create new, I guess it's still legislation, although I'm not sure if that's what you call it there, but to legalize or get rid of prior legislation which ban things like clubs and whatnot. Do they experience any conflict in those 2 areas? Because it would seem like slightly divergent directions.
No, I mean, there are different arms of Cinesex. So, like the trans program was focusing on reinstituting reassignment surgery, which I don't know if I made that clear, is now completely acceptable again. So, like the trans division of Cinesex was focusing on that, and then, the gays and the lesbians are focusing on same-sex. Those divisions are focusing on getting the government to change or recognize same-sex unions or marriages. But no, I don't think there was any sort of conflict between, I guess, demands countering each other. Like the emo gays want this, but the trans gays want, or the trans emos want this, or anything. I don't think there was anything like that.
Did she mention at all sort of whether it was common or not to have Americans who couldn't afford gender reassignment surgery come to Cuba to get it for free, or move there and get citizenship?
She didn't mention anything like that, but I do know that Cuba is not American, but Cuba is a top destination for European medical tourism. As for European gender or sexual reassignment medical tourism, I don't know. I haven't seen anything about that. But no, she didn't say anything about that. Okay, let's start the movie.